Hey there, I'm Cesar. I did a PhD in computer science, and during my research journey, there was one thing that I struggled with several times. It's called writer's block, and I think that most academics and researchers face it in one way or the other. So in this video, I will share my personal experiences when dealing with writer's block, and I will give you tips that helped me to overcome this issue when I was writing my papers. So last year, I was the typical PhD student doing research in the field of software engineering. I implemented my research tools, collected some data, and I had a clear vision of what the paper is gonna be about. So I was in the morning, sitting in my desk, surrounded by a pile of papers and a few empty coffee cups, like the usual. So I was trying to start writing my paper, but it didn't know how to start, and after hours fighting procrastination, my LaTeX template stayed mostly empty. I remember that I paused for a moment and kept looking at how the cursor was blinking at me, like challenging me. It was quite an interesting feeling. Okay, well, that situation that I just described is what writer's block is all about. And my opinion is that it is almost inevitably, and shows that the majority of researchers have been through it during their careers. But there are a few strategies that can help us to mitigate writer's block. And here's the first one: structure. I think the idea of sitting down and writing a full academic paper from scratch is completely overwhelming. I think that it is much better focusing on smaller goals one at a time. As brilliantly explained by Simon Peyton-Jones in his very famous talk titled How to Write a Great Research Paper, I will leave you the link in the description below, by the way. He explains that a great research paper should have a well-defined structure. So the first step to break the ice and combat writer's block is creating a clear outline for every section of the paper. I like to start by writing all headings and subheadings and then adding to-do notes below each of them to highlight the core ideas that I will cover. I think that starting a paper with an outline is actually a great idea because it is something that you have after all, so it cuts the blank page syndrome. And it's also good for guiding the writing in a much more structured manner. I would like to mention that there is no need to be creative at the beginning of the writing. Creativity arises more easily when there is already a substance to create from it. So I think it is better sticking to the standards regarding structure. A good paper reports the results of a research project concisely, and the academic community has very well-defined guidelines. Such guidance helps the peer reviewers to do the job. So it is a good idea to cooperate with the reviewers who ultimately will decide about the paper's fate. So I suggest looking at the structure of other papers already published in journals of conferences that you are targeting, and follow the exact same structure of one of the papers that you consider to be good. In the cases where I didn't know yet where to submit, then I just followed the general structure instead. For example, Section 1, Introduction, Section 2, Background, Section 3, Study Design, Section 4, Results, Section 5, Treats to Validity, Section 6, Related Work, and Section 7, Conclusions. In any case, I always take into account that it is very likely that the content and even the title of the paper are gonna be changed over time anyways. Once I'm done with the skeleton of the paper, then it's time for me to start adding content. I have found that one of the best ways to do this is by starting adding figures and results. So what I do is that I just draft a general figure that encapsulates the core idea of the paper. This figure could go into the study design section or could just go anywhere in the paper. In any case, it is still a good idea for me to have it done because it could help me later when presenting the core idea of the paper. So So after having this first figure, I create some tables and insert the preliminary results there. And of course, at this stage, I should already have some results, right? I think of the figures and table as the initial ingredients that I need to elaborate the rest of the content. And it is actually not that difficult. I have noticed that describing tables and figures is almost a mechanical process. After looking at this type of content in other papers, I have found similar patterns, like it's pretty much the same in all papers. So looking at the figure, describing the key insight from it, then looking at the outliers, both positives and negatives, come up with some explanation of them, then maybe describing a particular case, and so on. So for example, in one of my papers, the study designs were open source software applications. I wrote about the general descriptive statistic first, then I looked at some applications that deviate from the rest in some variable of interest, and used these as examples to support the core idea or contribution of my paper. So inserting figures, tables, and describing them is already a lot of white space that gets already filled in. So this gives me the very gratifying sensation of being making progress. I would like to mention that these techniques only works when I already have results. In other words, I really need to have some concrete results before I start writing the paper. And once I have figures and results in place, then I start working on the paragraph for the non-trivial sections of the paper. And that constitutes the novel content that I will put in. And for this, I think a good idea to begin with is to formulate questions. So what I do is that I write a series of questions in the LaTeX template as comments, and then I start answering such questions. So the challenge here is formulating the right question, right? For example, let's say that I'm writing the section that describes the data collection. What I do is that I write a question like, for example, which are the criteria to select the study subject? Why did I choose these criteria? Or what it is at the core of the data collection pipeline, for example. So once I have this kind of questions in place, then I have a hook that I can use later to turn into a narrative text using connectors. And by connectors, I mean phrases that already exist or ways that are well known for connecting and presenting research ideas. I think that mastering the art of asking the right questions and answering them effectively using connectors is great because it ensures a continuous flow of writing, which is actually essential for productivity. So talking about productivity, one of the tricks that helped me when I got stuck is paraphrasing the recurrent. Let me explain. I think a good research paper should convey a single idea, and this idea can be very simple or complex. I personally think that simple is better. And all the texts in the paper should orbit around this core idea. So in general, only 20% of the paper is usually dedicated to explaining the idea, and the remaining 80% consists of data and experiments to validate the idea. Therefore, the majority of a paper is filled by the recurrent supportive texts, which are basically procedures established by modern science. So I think that mastering the execution of these recurrent parts greatly simplifies the writing process. On the other hand, when I get stuck in a particular part, I just go and read other academic papers in the search of the exact same part. It also helps me to get some inspiration. And after reading a while, patterns immediately start to emerge from the text. I look at the filled words, the connectors that make each paragraph organic. Then I simply adapt or mutate the sentences on my paper to follow the exact same structure. I think plagiarism is not a problem here, by the way, because I'm not copy pasting. What I'm doing is I just adapting the structure of the sentences and paragraph to fit my own idea. So in any case, the most important here for me is to keep momentum, and there is always opportunity for improving something that already exists. In the same way that I think that criticizing something is generally easier than creating it from scratch. So editing is easier to do, and especially when something is already written, right? So in addition, I have also noticed that some sections are just repetitive, like they follow the same existing recipe. For example, the section that describes the related work doesn't need to be original. I think it's fine just summarizing and paraphrasing the key results of previous words there. So yes, I would say that paraphrasing is a great skill to have as a scientific writer. And in terms of writing, perfectionism is sometimes my worst enemy, actually. Perfectionism is a blocker. I think that one way to deal with it is learning to refine things later. So most of us want everything to be just right before even touching the keyboard. But the state of things almost never happen in practice. The perfect paragraph is almost never written at the first shot. So I'm trying to get it perfect in my head before sitting down and writing it sometimes, but it could be very, very hard for me to make progress this way. So what I do is that I forget about perfection and lower down my initial expectations. So I suggest just writing some sentences that encapsulate the core ideas of a section as bullet points and then refining them later. In other words, postponing the editing is a good strategy to move forward. This is because if I start editing right after finishing each sentence, then I will always have the temptation to switch to this editing mode every time I get hit by writer's block. Instead, what I do is that I switch to writing a different part of the paper and then edit only when I have a complete draft of a section. And by the way, here is another tip. Something that helps me when I got blocked is either write or do nothing. So let me explain. Writing is a very intense mental activity that demands a lot of energy, and our brains have evolved with a self-protection mechanism to have energy and to save resources. So every time we need to write, there is a signal that activates in our brains, causing resistance. It is what it is. So to me, writing a research paper is an act of willingness and perseverance. When I'm into it, I need to concentrate and forget about everything else besides the words that I want to say. Something that I do is to force myself to either write or do nothing. And I'm not talking about doing nothing like when you go and do a walk to grab a cup of coffee. No. I mean doing nothing at all. What happens is that when I do nothing, I enter into a mental state of boredom. And over time, this sensation of not being productive tends to be very, very uncomfortable to me. So it triggers a need on me to do something. Then I just write. It doesn't need to be great what I write. It just needs to be something that puts me out of this uncomfortable state of boredom. And yes, that's exactly the point. I intentionally push myself into a boredom state that it's so uncomfortable that I feel the need to write. I know that it sounds weird, but yeah. Anyways, let me share the last tip. Now imagine that the task of reading is already finished, and this last trick is very, very special and personal. It relies on a couple of facts. Like the first, as I mentioned before, it is always easier improving something that is already written than creating something from scratch. Second, after seeing something done, at least mentally, it seems easier to accomplish. I don't know what's the psychological term for that. Let me know in the comment if you know. But when I have nothing written, I just imagine that I have it done. And yes, I know it sounds a bit crazy, but it was really well for me. If I am able to imagine what I want to write in details, then it feels that I can write it. So when I got stuck, I close my eyes and visualize the part of the paper that I would like to have already written. I imagine that every section is filled with text, tables, and figures. The work is completed in my mind, jumping section by section and feeling the relief of having the work done. And this feels just amazing. It provides a sense of security and confidence that really helps me to continue writing. It is like when playing chess and you know exactly the move needed to win the game or take some crucial advantage. Once I find and visualize the right move in my mind, then the game seems simpler because of the existence of a plan. And it is a matter of finding and visualizing the good strategy to follow. And similarly to chess, writing is all about the strategies as well. So what I do is that I imagine that the next paragraph is done, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then I just write them. So to summarize what I have said in this video, it is normal as a researcher to experience writer's block, especially at the beginning of a paper. There is too much friction and resistance, and for me it all comes down to the fact that doing research is very hard per se. Structuring, following patterns, using the right filled words, and assembling existing ideas, these are some strategies that I have used many times when I encounter writer's block. And one last thing, my mindset is that I am always working on the first draft, which doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to have something to tweak, and you know, it is all about making progress step by step. So I hope this video could help you to deal with writer's block. See you in the next one. Bye.